I started reading a bunch of books. I got into a 12-step program, but I just wanted to understand my brain at a deeper level. I started studying addiction psychology, and that led me into neuroscience because all of these patterns that I had developed and that everyone develops, whether it's an addiction or not, are formed as neural pathways in the brain. They're strings of neurons that represent the experiences and the patterns that they're repeating in their lives.
Welcome to the show, George.
Hey, Mark, great to be here. Thanks for having me. Happy Sunday.
Happy Sunday. Welcome to Peak Performance Perspective, where we help entrepreneurs live a full life full of health, wealth, and happiness. Now, as a certified transformational neuroscience coach and educator, what does peak performance mean to you?
To me, coming from a neuroscience background, it's all about optimizing mental resources. What I've learned about the brain is that it is capable of so much. And to me, what the objective is to try to maximize the amount of resources that you have in your mind by working with the brain's functionality and then spending those resources as efficiently as possible. Every morning we start out with a tank in our brains of resources, and the idea is to create a lifestyle that optimizes and maximizes the amount of resources that you start every day with, and then spending those resources as efficiently as possible throughout the day by understanding the cost of certain activities on those resources. Stress is a very expensive mental resource. So if we can eliminate stress, then we optimize the resources that we still have available for us to do the activities and perform the way that we really want to throughout the day.
What was the moment that made you realize that something had to change in your life?
As you and I have discussed, I have a story of addiction. There was a real turning point in my life. I grew up in a very privileged upbringing and yet difficult in many ways. It caused me a lot of internal discomfort, a lot of mental discomfort growing up. I have a lot of addiction in my family. So the combination of that mental discomfort and first trying drugs and alcohol in college, that combination set me off on a path where I was medicating my anxieties and my mental discomforts with substances. And I was a high functioning entrepreneur for 30 years, founded and built and led several companies. But I always had this underlying discomfort, quick to anger, highly reactive. My nervous system was highly activated, stressed out a lot, very defensive. And that wears on you. And I would just be very uncomfortable in my own skin. And I would medicate those discomforts with drugs and alcohol. And that went on for a better part of 30 years and until I hit a bottom in my early 50s. And at that point, I knew I had to change. I was out of options and things had gotten so bad that I just could not stop using. At that time, it was pain pills and alcohol. And it had taken over my life. So I knew I had to change at that time.
Addiction recovery is deeply personal. What did the rewiring of your brain look like in the early stages?
Yeah, at that moment when you're succumbing to addiction, you just have no idea how you got there. At least I didn't understand the science of addiction, what happens in the brain, and how I was going to be able to change. I just was lost, and I'd reached this. I liken it to a mouse in a maze where he's just gone left, gone looking for all these different options to still maintain the life he was living. And at the end of the day, he gets to the end of the maze and he's in this room and there's no more lefts and rights. He's just stuck at the end of the maze and all that's in there is a mirror. And I had to take a hard look at myself. So it set me off on a path that I was really in desperate straits, and I knew I had to change and I wanted to change deep down. So I gave it one more try. Even though I was into my midlife, I just knew that I didn't want to go out that way. So I started reading a bunch of books. I got into a 12-step program, but I just wanted to understand my brain at a deeper level. I started studying addiction psychology, and that led me into neuroscience because all of these patterns that I had developed and that everyone develops, whether it's an addiction or not, are formed as neural pathways in the brain. They're strings of neurons that represent the experiences and the patterns that they're repeating in their lives. And so, yeah, that gave me the understanding that, okay, this is where I was, and I had these patterns in my brain, but thank goodness the brain is forgiving and that it's willing to, through neuroplasticity, cause the neural pathways to shift and new ones form if we choose to live a different lifestyle. And so that's what I did. I started living a different lifestyle. And then over time, the brain begins to respond to that. And the neurons actually shift in your brain, and a whole new mapping takes place called rewiring of the brain.
Looking back at your story, I know there was addiction in the family and maybe there was some genetic predisposition, but how did entrepreneurship contribute towards that struggle?
Yeah, so for all of us that have been entrepreneurs and are entrepreneurs, we know that it's a stressful occupation, right? Everything is on us. We don't have a lot of support systems unless we create them. And so we're wearing all the hats. We're working pretty much 24/7. And it's just a highly activated profession. And we tend to wear a lot of stress potentially if we don't have a good relationship with it. And so it really just compounded my discomfort. I was already uncomfortable from my childhood. I was always trying to prove myself, prove that I was worthy. I think I was trying to measure up to what my father had done. He was very successful. And I just was on this never-ending quest to produce and achieve and accomplish, I think, to try to prove myself to myself that I was significant, right? And so that's a deep understanding. And then being an entrepreneur, you're just always adding stress onto that existing mental discomfort. And it just caused me to become highly activated. Probably not the best occupation for someone that was struggling mentally in other ways, but it was what it was. And that's my story. And through the combination of those things, I was medicating, as I said, and that's just how I dealt with my situation. But the other thing I think that caused me to want to be an entrepreneur was I'd fended for myself a lot as a young person. I had gone to prep school in ninth grade. My parents moved overseas. And I had moved like many times as a child as my dad was progressing up the corporate ladder. So there was a lot of having to figure things out on my own, adapt to new environments. And so it just formed this pattern within me that I wanted to determine my own destiny, call my own shots. And I just knew I had this calling deep within me that I wanted to be an entrepreneur.
I know it was a gradual process to be in that life and then becoming who you are today. But when you're looking back at it, was there a specific day or a moment that sticks out when you had the most clarity in knowing that I need to change? I can't continue doing it this way.
I have this picture that I took of myself that I've shared with you. And it was that moment, that weekend before I went into rehab, where my life began to turn. And I keep that picture with me so that I just have this reminder. It's a marker in my life. And it was a moment of complete loss of control where the drugs had taken me over and I just had no more control over the use of them. And I was helpless. And I'd never been that way as an entrepreneur and as somebody who was independent, very self-sufficient and high performing. I just had always had control. And so it was a complete the feeling of a loss of control was really transformative to me. It was just a real awakening. And I just looked at myself in the mirror and I knew I was going into rehab that Monday morning. And I just said, I do not want to go out this way. I do not want my family to have to live with what I've become. And so that moment just still sticks out clearly in my mind as the one that started the turnaround, that awareness.
How was your family coping with all of this when you were really deep into it?
And my mom's side of the family, that's where the addiction comes from. And my mom was in active addiction also, but she was in denial. She wasn't really able to share that experience with me because she was in denial. And so that was a little bit of a bummer because I would have loved to have shared that experience with her. My father was very supportive in the way that he understood to be. He was all about George has got to fix this problem, and he was right. At the end of the day, anyone that's struggling from addiction has to solve their own problem. It's up to them to pull themselves up and figure out how to, with support from people that have been through it, figure out how to get through it. And my sister was very helpful. My wife is just a saint. She stuck with me through this whole thing. So I'd say by and large, everyone was supportive as they could be or needed to be. But people that aren't in addiction, that haven't fallen prey to it, don't fully understand what needs to happen. And I felt love and support to the degree that I needed to. And I just, at that point, it's really up to the individual. Do they want to get better or not?
Many of us struggle with addiction at so many different levels. Obviously, yours levels is at a whole different thing, right? You hit rock bottom real hard. You kind of have to come up from there. At your lowest point, can you tell us what you learned at your lowest point? Something that textbooks don't teach?
Yeah, as the entrepreneurs out there will relate to, it's about setbacks and what you do in response. And that's really, to me, the meaning of life is, as we know that in the human brain, there's a pain pleasure seesaw that goes on, a homeostasis. And the brain is always searching for that equilibrium. And in entrepreneurialism, we confront that a lot. We have a lot of moments of setback. It's par for the course. It goes along with the territory, and it's what we do in response. So really, I had always known, because at that point I started and operated a number of businesses, some that went better than others. And so I was used to setbacks and responding and resilience. So to me, the biggest reinforcing values and qualities that I have within me, my strengths, are resilience and perseverance. And so that's really what this was. This was a moment that was the hardest moment, even amongst any entrepreneurial experience I've ever had, that I ever had to overcome, because I just didn't know what was next. I just knew that what I had been doing wasn't working, but I had no idea like how to respond. I just knew that I had to bring the motivation, the commitment, the perseverance, and the resilience to the party to be able to find another version of myself that was going to be worth living.
We talk a lot about metacognition. In simple terms, what is metacognition and why does it matter so much?
Yeah, so metacognition is the ability to understand the brain, how it functions, and to optimize its resources and to manage them, and to be able to, on the fly, through understanding and awareness and knowledge, be able to manage your thoughts, feelings, and actions as they happen. And so in order to do that, you really need to have an understanding of the brain and how it works. And that's the thing that I've valued most out of this entire experience of recovery and transformation for myself, is just this deeper understanding. I had no understanding of the brain, frankly. I just thought that the brain was what it was, and I just let it dictate my life to me. Come to find out, the brain will respond to whatever direction that we give it. It's very trainable. And just like our bodies, I was an athlete. I was very used to training my body. I just had no idea that the brain could be trained in the same way. And that's exactly the case. And we are, at any point in time, a culmination, or think of ourselves as like a computer hard drive that has had all these experiences, all these files that have been saved in it. And so our brain is a blueprint of that. And the neurons have formed patterns based on all these thoughts, feelings, and actions that we've ever taken in our life. And so if you think of a map, like the Rand McNally Atlas, when you look at the United States with all the major highways and all the little roads and everything else, everyone has a map like that in their brain. And it's all been based on all their thoughts and feelings and experiences that they've ever had. And so metacognition is the ability to say, okay, I am where I am today, but now I know that I can change that map by thinking, feeling, and acting differently today and in the future. And that map will physically change to respond to any ways that I prefer to be in the future. So if I'm not happy with how things are going in any way, maybe I have racing thoughts, I don't handle stress well, I'm emotionally reactive, I procrastinate a lot, like I'm scattered, all of those things are trainable. And so we can actually get out of the passenger seat of the car and get into the driver's seat and put our hands on our brain and actually guide it and direct it. It is fascinating how much what we can do with our brains if we understand how, and if we really are interested in coursing the direction of it.
If someone's listening to it, what's the first step they can take to becoming more aware of their mental activity?
It really helps to understand first and foremost, how the brain functions. So just as an example, all of our thoughts or feelings, let's just take those, but any mental experience emerges in real time, every single time it happens. And so I'm not sure if how many of us have really thought about, okay, when an emotion happens to me or when a thought emerges in my brain, like how is that actually coming to be? And do I have any control over what those things actually are? And the answer is yes. But the first step to me is to understand how that happens at a high level. And so then you can then, because the power is in information, it's in understanding, it's in awareness. And then once you understand how the brain works and forms these things, then you can then intervene strategically and with understanding and purpose and knowledge to then begin to tweak what actually is emerging into your mind.
What are some that people have about how their brain works?
Misconceptions?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's this idea that it's a fixed entity, that it's a lack of awareness around how formable, malleable, changeable, and adaptable the brain is. Frankly, our brains today are different than they were yesterday. And every night when we sleep, the brain goes through a series of processes while we're sleeping. And this is why sleep is so critical. It's not just for rest, it's memory gets consolidated. So all the things that we learned and experienced during that day gets transferred from an area of our brain called the hippocampus into long-term memory. So it's a consolidation. It grabs all the information from that day and transfers it into a different part of the brain to store it for access later on. And that's just one of the systems that functions that happens at night. The other one is the glymphatic system sends fluids up into our brain and pulls out all the waste from that doesn't need to be there anymore. All the toxins come out. And there's all this changing going on in our brain anyway. The question becomes, do we want to get involved in that change and actually direct the direction of it? Because there are very specific things we can do. I live my day every day now with in service of my brain. So I eat the things I eat when I eat. I exercise the type of exercise, and when I exercise, my sleep is built around what it can do for the brain. I have mindfulness practices and do things in the morning, first thing, in service to my brain, all because I know how the brain's going to react to these things. And when I get thoughts and feelings that I don't like, I know what to do about them to guide them in a different direction going forward. I'll give an example of that if it's okay. A lot of us have these patterns that have developed, again, our thoughts and feelings and actions that we tend to recreate over and over again. And my analogy for this is that if you think of a big tree in your backyard that's got these roots now that are coming out of the ground and they're really strong and well developed and all of that, that's our neurons, our neural pathways that we've patterned and developed over the years as we sit here today. But let's say that some of those roots are not helping us. We're highly reactive emotionally, or we don't like some of the emotions that are coming to us. We don't like how we're behaving in response. We don't like our relationship with stress. We don't like our racing thoughts. We don't like procrastination. These are all roots in our brains. They're neural pathways that represent patterns and as you've noticed, like you probably reenact some of these things over and over again. And when you do that, you are watering and fertilizing those roots, which is why they get deeper and stronger and more well developed. So what we do in transformation, specifically in my type of coaching, which is neuroscience, is we go over to another part of the yard and we plant a brand new tree. And when we plant it, it's small and not well developed, and it's got these thin roots that are in the ground. But what this new tree represents is a whole new way that we would prefer to think and feel and act. Maybe it's in a relationship to stress. And so we start to identify what these new patterns that we'd like to have. We draw them out, we visualize them, and we say, okay, why are these better for us? And they represent what I'd like my identity to be. They tie into my values better. I don't want to be angry. I don't want to be reactive. I don't want to be these things. And so we deconstruct why we're acting the ways we are and thinking and feeling the ways we are. And then we rebuild them in new ways conceptually. And then we begin to practice them in real life. And so that's this brand new tree that we've just planted. And every time we go through the repetitions of this new way of being, we are watering and fertilizing this new tree. And these roots then gradually, through practice and repetition over a period of time, begin to get stronger and more developed. While that's happening, the roots from the old tree, because we're not acting or thinking or feeling that way anymore, they begin to get weaker and go more dormant. And so because we're not strengthening, watering, and fertilizing them. And so that's really the process of transformation, is just envisioning a new way of being and then setting up a lifestyle and a way of living every minute of every day in new ways that we practice, which then start to form new neural pathways in the brain, which are like this new tree. And then before you know it, after a period of 60 and 90 days, if you're really fastidious about this approach, you will find that you no longer you start to shift and change. It's almost like you're not even aware that it's happening. But if you sit back and just analyze where you are, you're like, holy mackerel, I'm different. And it's all because you're thinking and feeling and acting differently. You're practicing it through repetition and you're getting better at it. You're training, the brain is forming new patterns, neural pathways. And before you know it, you're in this process of shifting and becoming different.
Why is it that we struggle so much from breaking out of self-sabotaging patterns, even though we want to change so bad?
Yeah, so what it gets back to is the brain. Its number one job is to protect us, keep us safe, and survive, and manage internal resources because our brains and bodies require a lot of energy. So the brain wants to conserve resources and manage our bodily systems, all in the interest of keeping us safe and surviving. That's it. That is the brain's number one job. All these other things, like nice houses and nice cars and this and that, are not of the concern of the brain. Okay. It just wants to keep you surviving. So, what the brain likes is predictability, because it knows if it can predict everything about you, then it knows that it perceives that as safe and that it can keep you in a survival mode. When you're asking it to change and become different, it doesn't know what that looks like. It doesn't know if it's safe. And so it is reticent to go there because it hasn't been there yet and it doesn't know where you're taking it. And so that is why the brain is resistant to change and why you feel like you don't want to go there. And it also doesn't know how many resources it's going to take to go there. And its job is to conserve resources. And that's why the brain prefers to stay in predictable patterns, is because it knows that it can help keep you safe and survived in that environment, even if it's unpleasant, even if you're not experiencing a great life or mental life, it still knows that it can keep you surviving in those patterns. It doesn't know this other place that you want to take it.
When most of us are struggling with something, we don't like a version of us, any habits that we have, the first go-to is willpower. That, okay, this is it. This is what I'm going to do. This is how I'm going to change. So, what role does willpower really play into behavioral change? Is it overrated? Is it underrated?
So it's what you need at the beginning, because when you are transforming, which is basically starting off with new thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and you're wanting to have them become habitual, meaning they move from the front part of your brain where you begin to envision them and think about them into the back part of their brain where they become habits and you don't think about them anymore, kind of like the English language or riding a bike or brushing your teeth. You don't think about those things anymore. And that's where you're ultimately wanting to get these changes. You're wanting to transfer them from the front part of their brain to the rear part of the brain. At the very beginning of these changes will be critical, because again, you're having to force your brain to go there. Okay. And willpower is a byproduct or a product of the front part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, where all of the heavy duty thinking and analysis and evaluation and decision making goes on. And that's where all new change starts. Okay. But the two things that are required for it to become easier and shift out of willpower, because willpower is an expendable resource. It's highly demanding and expensive. And remember what we said is the brain wants to conserve resources. So that's why willpower feels so expensive and hard, is because it's very costly on the brain. Okay. We only have so many resources in a day. Willpower is very costly. So the brain doesn't want to use it that much because, again, it's trying to conserve resources. Okay. So the things that are critical are repetition and reward. Okay. So the brain wants reward. And so we've all heard of the neurotransmitters, these feel good chemicals that travel through us, that when we get goosebumps, when we have a spike of pleasure, that's dopamine, it's serotonin, it's endorphins, it's oxytocin if it's a social feel good. And so the brain will respond to reward. It's wired that way. And so if you can begin to introduce reward to these things that you're wanting to put into practice, these changes you're wanting to make, if you can begin to experience reward, the brain says, oh, this is now rewarding. I like that. I'm going to make it less hard to go there. I'm going to want to go there. And so just by virtue of it, you introducing reward, you're not having to use willpower as much because the brain is less resistant because it wants to follow the reward. The other thing that's critical is repetition. And just think about anything else you've ever asked your brain to do. Learn a new language, learn a new instrument, learn a new athletic endeavor. When you first started, it was very much a function of willpower. You had to force yourself to stay in it. You weren't good at it. Your brain wasn't getting any reward because it was frustrated. And so you had to fight through it with willpower. But the more you did it, the better you got at it, which means the brain learns through repetition. And so we all know that, right? Anything we've ever learned how to do, we've had to do through repetition. And so that's the same thing with teaching the brain anything, even new thoughts and feelings. We can teach them new thoughts and feelings, but it just requires repetition and reward. And so that's really the crux of this, is you can become different mentally. You can have different mental experiences, just like you can learn how to play an instrument or learn how to golf. It's exactly the same thing. You're teaching the brain through repetition and reward that this way of thinking and feeling is going to be better for you. And all I have to do is keep practicing it. And eventually it'll just become one part of my skill set. And that's exactly what metacognition is. It's a skill set of how to manage your mental activity. And it's achieved in the same way that you would learn anything new.
Entrepreneurship is hard, like we discussed earlier. Sometimes, especially in the beginning stages, you're working 7 days a week, 16-hour days, just to try to keep this thing afloat. Mental burnout is something entrepreneurs really struggle with. So, what are some telltale signs that somebody's burning out mentally, and what are some of these hidden mental drains that they should be looking out for?
Yeah, so that's where the fascinating thing is. An entrepreneur could look at their mental resources as like a tank, like a gas tank. And that tank is a certain size in every one of us. And it's a combination of a number of different resources that we have mentally. Things like glucose, attention bandwidth, level of focus, and so on. And so that tank has a certain capacity. Now, that capacity can be expanded based on our training our brains and giving it the types of things it wants and needs in order to expand the tank. Things like sleep, things like nutrition, diet, which are different, exercise, mindfulness practices like meditation and other types of focus exercises, attention exercises. So that tank can be expanded over time. And so if we think of our minds that way, that we have this tank that's a certain capacity that we can expand over time. And the importance is to fill it as high as we can. If it's a 30-gallon tank, we want it to get to 30 gallons at the beginning of every day so that we have max resources. And then we want to watch every day for how we're spending those resources. And things like burnout, which is really the end result of stress, are highly expensive metabolic events. And so if we understand the ones that are highly expensive, then we would try to stay away from them or notice when they're coming so that we can head them off and reset and then start again, so that we're very efficient with how we spend those 30 gallons of mental resource during the day. And that's really where I can help entrepreneurs a lot, is understanding just this big picture. Again, I think we just take these brains for granted that they're just going to be there and perform no matter what. We know our cars don't, the engines of our cars don't. They need to go in for oil and filter changes and all these other updates in order for them to run better. The same thing goes with our minds. And multitasking is another example of a highly expensive resource when you're going back and forth between tasks as opposed to focusing on one. And so if we knew that going in, we wouldn't multitask. We would stay focused on a task, and then we would leave it and go to another task. Another example is our brains are geared for 90-minute stints. At the end of 90 minutes, the expenditure rate on our mental resources begins to accelerate, and we hit a diminishing return. So we hit the top of the graph at 90 minutes, top of the curve, and then we start to spend resources at an exponentially higher rate, and we get less and less output because our front part of our brains get fatigued. And so all we need to do is stop for 3 to 5 minutes and have these reset activities. It could be breathing with eyes closed. It could be getting outside in the sun, shutting off the brain. It could be meditating. It could be it could be doing push-ups, anything to stop your brain from, and in that time, what's happened during the 90 minutes is you've got cortisol, which is a highly metabolic hormone. People think of it as a stress hormone. It starts to climb, and the 3 to 5 minutes allows it to drain back out of the system and cause your brain to get clear again. The neurotransmitters we begin to use them up at the end of 90 minutes, and they begin to reset and rejuvenate. So there's just all these things that we could do during our day to manage the optimum utilization of our mental resources. And so that's what I help people do, is just understand the big picture, how the brain works, and then how to set up their day, their diets, when they're eating, how much they're eating. Eating these big lunches is no good because you divert mental resources away from your brain into digesting the food. It just goes on to where you could actually strategically diagram your entire day in service of optimum mental performance.
If I'm listening to this podcast, what is a question that you want me to consider about my life so that things can get clear about what I really need to do? What's a question that tends to crack things open for your clients?
Yeah. How well do you understand your brain? And do you think that you could get more out of would you like to understand your brain? Doesn't it make sense to understand your brain? And do you think you could get more out of your life in all respects if you did understand your brain? Would you like to control all the mental activity that goes on in your brain, as opposed to just being in service of what it provides to you? Are you happy with where you are? If you were to pass away tomorrow, this is always the acid test. Are you happy with where you are? And that's not really in terms of achievement, pelts on the wall. It's, have you reached your potential? Are you in command of yourself? Are you operating in alignment with your values, your beliefs? Are you in congruence with who you want to be, that version of yourself? Sorry, you asked me for one question. I gave you a bunch, but they're really the acid test type of questions where, because time ticks. And that's what I had to confront when I was 52 and hitting my bottom. Is this the way I wanted to go out? If I were to go out, if I were to not recover, would this be okay? And it sure as heck was not okay with me. And I was willing to do whatever it took. And the problem is a lot of people's lives are not where mine was. And so they're not at that really life and death crossroads, or things aren't so bad that they think, do I really need to change? Or is there anything else better out there? But those are the type of self-reflective questions and discovery questions, awareness questions you want to ask yourself. Could it be even better? Could I be in total command? Could I be in total alignment with who I really want to be? And it's not just work, right? Am I successful in my relationships with my significant other, with my children, in the way I want to be? And that's another thing we as entrepreneurs, we don't have a lot of time for other things. And so the question becomes, are there other things in my world that I wish I was better at, paying more attention to? And how can I possibly do that? Is it just a matter of time allocation? And a lot of times it's not. It's a matter of presence. And how do I get more present when I'm with my loved ones? And that's all a function of the brain. It's all things that can be practiced. And it's just a matter of asking yourself, am I wanting to discover more? Is there more out there I could learn about myself, how my brain operates that could maybe take me to a different level?
Sometimes there's such a disconnect in between our logical self and our emotional self. So, entrepreneurs listening to this, they understand logically all the things that you're telling them. But how do you help achievers, high achievers, slow down without feeling that they're losing momentum? Because that's almost an emotional response.
Yeah, I really try to come at it from an education point of view. And entrepreneurs are highly curious and they love learning new things to get them where they envision themselves going. And so I really try to approach this as an education thing. And I'll just tell you, everyone I've ever worked with, no matter how smart they are, there's always moments in our time together where they just have these epiphanies, these insights that are like, holy mackerel. And they don't have to be earth shattering in the intellectual sense. They just have developed these patterns over time of ways of thinking. And they've thought that way so often and so frequently over such a long period of time that they can't really, they just need a door open for them to see things a slightly different way. And then it can just cause these unbelievable shifts. And so, really, it's just about me throwing information out there, working with how they think and feel at the moment, educating, just again, giving them information about their brains, how it works, and they find the openings. They find the information that really resonates with them, and they suddenly have these incredible insights about what they can do with this information. So it's really just about educating them and then let them figure out how it applies to their lives. But there hasn't been one person that's just not been very much affected by our work together. And it's them, it's the client or the individual that finds that information that is most impactful to them.
If someone is listening to this today and they're feeling stuck, overwhelmed, or even unsure where to begin, what would you say is the first step they should take?
It's an awareness. I would just like to offer hope and encouragement that things can change. Everyone can change. The brain is made to change. All of this stuckness resides in the brain in the form of these patterns that have been so well rehearsed and practiced over the years by us that they have formed these deep roots that we can't seem to break free of. And the first thing is a message of hope and encouragement that no matter how stuck you feel, change and breakthrough and transformation is right around the corner, but you have to understand how to get from point A to point B. And that's where just someone like myself that has been through it with people and been through it with myself understands the path. I didn't understand it. I was very much stuck and had no idea until I got into a 12-step program. But then actually, most of what I've learned about what I'm talking about today was through my own reading and studies. And then I took graduate level coursework in neuroscience. And that's where my epiphany started to happen. And it's just that working with a neuroscience coach like myself can help guide and direct that process, short circuited. I've been at this 12 years now since I hit bottom, and I learn more every day. But by working with someone, like typically in a 90-day engagement relationship that I have with someone, meeting once a week for 90 minutes a week, plus education in between, there is a really dramatic shift that happens over a 90-day period of time.
George, there are so many out there that are struggling with the demons that are holding them back. For you to have experienced some of that, hit rock bottom, not only come out of it successful, but also put yourself in a position where you can help and educate others and bring them out of misery. It speaks volumes about the type of person you are. It's an honor and a pleasure to be able to have you on my show and interview you and use this platform to be able to spread your message. What are some ways listeners can connect with you?
Yeah, you'll find me on LinkedIn. My name is George Haymaker, Haymaker. And then I have a website which talks about the type of work I do, the people I work with, and it's georgehaymaker.com. There's a link on there for a discovery call that's free that we can get together. And even if you just want to have a conversation, you're not sure you're ready for coaching, you just want to talk about maybe what you're struggling with or how to expand your ability to manage your mind and maximize mental resources. It doesn't have to be a problem you're dealing with. It can just be how to get more out of it. If you just want to have a conversation, I'm open to that. No pressure, no pitch. So feel free to visit the website and reach out. Be happy to talk.
Thank you so much for being on the show, George.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Mark.